Let us, we will wait a couple of minutes and then we will start. I think let's start. We can go ahead now, Robert. Again, it's a pleasure to welcome you all, colleagues, in our second module in the Leadership in Education Strategic and Operational Dimension, Professional Development Certificate. Our module will be today about leading change in education, and it will be run by Dr. Robert Fersen. Dr. Robert is the chair of Education Department, College of Art and Science at New York Institute of Technology. In addition to his role in higher education, Dr. Robert has deep background in B-12 education as a school leader. Dr. Robert has published several educational journals and magazines. He is the co-author of the forthcoming article in Educational Leadership entitled Constructive Conflict, Critical Conversations Can Build Your School's Capacity to Grow and Learn, as well as the forthcoming book, School Capacity, From Conflict to Collaboration, School Leaders Guide to Problem Solve Power. He is also the co-author of How to Get the Teaching Job You Want, a highly regarded guide to the job search process in education, and the co-editor of Handbook of Research on Media Literacy Research and Application. Dr. Robert has also presented numerous international, national, and regional conferences. Dr. Robert served as a co-chair in Superintendent's College President, Partnership served as sorry, because I'm reading from the Word document in front of me. I'm trying to make it the size bigger. Sorry for that. Yes, Dr. Robert served as a co-chair of College President Partnership CSPP, a group dedicated in increasing collaborative between school district and college on Long Island. He also served as a co-chair of the SCCP High School Counselor College Advisor Work Group. A chapter based on this work is published in Creating School Partnership That Work, a guide for practice and research. Dr. Robert holds a degree from Stony Brook University, Queens College, and Fordham University, where he earned his doctorate in school administration and supervision. Dr. Robert, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's morning here in New York. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to speak with you today. And thank you for the introduction. I hope that we're able to have some opportunities to speak with each other today and engage in some interaction. Even though we're separated by, I think, 6,850 miles or about 11,000 kilometers. You heard I work at New York Institute of Technology, which is a university just outside of New York City. Actually, we have a campus in New York City and just outside of New York City. I thought I'm going to share my screen if that's okay.
Please, Dr. Robert, yeah.
Here we go. So I thought I'd share a little bit about my background. You heard some of it. I did start out as a teacher of history, social studies. Then I became a teacher in special education, working with students with disabilities. I've had kind of a long career in school administration and leadership. I was an assistant principal at the middle school level. I was a elementary school principal and a middle school principal. I was in the central office, and I was a superintendent of schools for a dozen years before I became an assistant professor and then department chair at NYIT. So, and I've taught undergraduates and graduates in universities. In addition to being the chair of the education department, I teach courses in school leadership for those interested in becoming department leaders, building leaders, and district leaders. Our program at NYIT has two themes, and one is diversity, because we recognize that not all students are the same wherever you go, whether it's the United States or any other country. And the second one is technology. You know, the pandemic has certainly changed schooling dramatically for the short term, but it also accelerated increased trends that have been existing for several decades. Now, way back when I started in education, the first computer I worked with was called a Commodore PET. And there may be very few of you who remember what those looked like. They were big machines and they could do very little other than perhaps some arithmetic computations. And we've certainly gone beyond that. Our approach at NYIT is not to teach students or our candidates apps. We don't teach them this app is better than that app or anything like that. Instead, what we do is try to teach school leaders how to understand the power of technology and its limitations as well, so that they can make the best decisions for their school communities. We teach how to use technology to achieve goals that enhance student learning and that promote organizational health. A little bit about my educational background. As I said, I started as a social studies teacher. I have degrees in history, I have a degree in special education, and I also have degrees in school leadership. My doctorate is from Fordham University in New York. And my research interests include the study of school culture, which is something we're going to talk about in this presentation, school-university partnerships, school counselor-principal relationships, teacher and principal hiring and retention, and conflict, which we'll also talk a little bit about as we move forward through the presentation. So most of my experience has been in pre-K to 12 education, and I carry that focus into my work. I'm committed to helping us understand how schools can become more effective. And in that regard, I enjoy the research, but whatever skills and understandings I develop, I think are best used when they can help people who are practitioners in the field, help people who are doing the work with students every day to lead their schools to higher level of performance. So I hope that what you take away from our time together today are some perspectives of how schools operate and how school leaders and those interested in school improvement can promote change, productive change, and even more importantly, lasting change. I don't know if you're going to hear anything you've not heard before, but hopefully we will be able to put it together in ways that provide some insights and some actual tools you can use on the job. So our topics will include the reasons why we talk so much about change when we talk about schooling, the fact that schools are organizations, and what does that mean? What does that mean for the way that they act? Factors that influence the possibility and the pace of change, how quickly it can go. I'm going to suggest to you a framework, a way of looking at change that can help you as you guide your efforts with change. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to look at the chat at the same time. Whoops, sorry. And strategies to address resistance to change and how we can address conflict, because conflict is almost inevitable at some level when humans get together, how we can address conflict to promote meaningful and sustainable change, changes that last. And then we'll have time for questions and answers, I hope. And then we'll also have some time, I hope, in the presentation to interact with each other. And I'm going to ask my colleagues over in Abu Dhabi if they can just let me know if there's somebody who's got a raised hand, because it's difficult to see when the full screen is on. Okay. Um, so our topic is change, but I thought this image provides a good starting point for our discussion. You know, big ships can't just decide whether to make a right turn or a left turn. Um, you know, they turn very slowly, and it takes time, it takes consistency, it takes planning. You can't just jerk the helm around and think that the boat will change direction. You also need an understanding of the waters around you, the conditions around you. Are the seas calm? Are they choppy? What's the wind like? How deep is the sea beneath you? So I thought that was the same with our notion of change in schools. Under most circumstances, schools can't change direction very quickly. For them to go from one place to another takes time, consistency, planning, and a knowledge of the surrounding conditions. And we find even then, when we have that kind of understanding, the ship or the school might still be reluctant to turn in the desired direction. They get bogged down in questions about which direction to turn, or even whether turning is necessary or might even be worse than the course that they're currently on now. So in the United States, and you may have heard about this, may be aware of it, you may have something similar in your own settings. We've had years of debate about curriculum and how to teach many subjects, but particularly two key areas for us in the US, which are mathematics and reading. Teachers, scholars, and school leaders have engaged in discussions, sometimes very heated discussions, about whether, for example, it's best in mathematics to teach basic operations like addition and subtraction by having students engage in lots of practice with the algorithm, with the applications of the algorithms, or whether through decomposing or composing numbers, or through using manipulatives or not using manipulatives. They've also argued very extensively about when to introduce algebraic concepts or how to teach math problem solving. And in reading, the same thing has occurred, with folks discussing whether or not students should be taught to either memorize words or look at sound symbol um, correspondence, or whether just to have students read and focus on comprehension, focus on understanding, and use the clues that text provides. And you know, you can find people who believe in any of those approaches everywhere. They're scattered across the country. They're in universities. They're in schools. They're at home, parents with their own opinions. And for each of these views, change from one thing to another has been very slow or halting, choppy, and may even have gone backwards, have been reversed from time to time. So you kind of get the feeling that things don't change. But then, you know, again, I was trained as an historian originally, and I think that's an exaggeration, because when we think about it, you know, schools do change. And so let's take a quick walk through history. This is a photograph of an early 20th century high school class. You could probably, even if you didn't know what year, you probably would be able to guess approximately the time period just from the way students are dressed, the way the teacher is standing, the way the classroom looks, etc. On the left, now we've moved into the 1960s. You know, it's less formal, more likely to encourage some student interaction here. We have the students, you know, pretty close to each other as opposed to separated as they were in the previous picture. By the way, I feel very sad for this student right in front, because I don't know what he did to deserve being right in front of a teacher like that, under the teacher's nose. So this is from the 60s. Now, on the right, we have the 1980s. And you can look at this, and the classroom is again different. We have students in different groups. We have some working more directly with the teacher. We have some perhaps working on their own. Look at the decorations, much more child-centered. So certainly the classroom is a lot more lively, more colorful, more engaging. Now, this is a photograph of, on the left, of a classroom from the first decade of this century, the 21st century, and we see more change. We've got a lot of technology in use. The blackboard, actually, if you can see it, is mostly covered. So we don't think that the teacher even uses the blackboard very much. There's a monitor up here on the wall, and it looks like students are working on something presented on their laptops. Then on the right, this is a pretty recent photo of a classroom during the pandemic. Clearly a change from even years earlier, where we have, looks like a synchronous Zoom session going on a whiteboard over here. We have the teachers working with an individual student rather than the whole class at once. Technology has advanced even further. Laptops are smaller. And there may even be different assignments for different students. And again, we have different philosophies now in education that have taken hold. On the left is a graphic showing the foundational elements of differentiated instruction, the belief that all students don't necessarily have the same strengths, needs, backgrounds, and therefore instruction should be tailored to their individual needs. Differentiated instruction says that there can be multiple pathways to achieving the same learning goals. And on the right, we have a graphic representing the changes in our approaches to students with disabilities. In the USA, pretty much before the 1970s, such students were assigned to special schools generally, if they had schooling at all. Expectations for them were low, and it was assumed that they could never succeed with challenging curriculum or go to college, or maybe even complete high school. The idea that placing a good percentage of them in a typical classroom with typical students was deemed preposterous, could never succeed. Now the situation is radically different, with many of those students engaged in typical classrooms and many succeeding through high school and through college. And some of that success was assisted by technology, which we see here. But technology, of course, hasn't been reserved to those with special needs. It's everywhere, it's ubiquitous. And especially after the pandemic, it's going to be an integral part of schooling in the future. I love the expression on these students' faces, because that moment of joy is something that makes every educator's heart warm. So there have been changes, and change is possible. On the other hand, as we look back on the quick trip through time that we just took, we see there are some elements that remain the same. Teachers have changed over time, but the basic structure of the classroom, seen here on the left, is pretty much the same. If someone from another planet visited us and looked at that series of photographs that I just showed you, I think they'd say that the model is still more like this one on the right in its bare outline, with the teacher leading and the students following, than different. So how can we develop our understanding of schools to identify the conditions and factors that make some changes more likely than others, as well as the leadership strategies that could promote the desired changes, and equally important, make sure that the changes we'd like to see happen actually take hold and last. So today, even when students maybe are at home learning online, as many have over the past number of months, the mental image, the picture of schooling that we have in our minds still kind of rules our thinking. And we saw this during the pandemic, when the first reaction was, even if you were online, to try to impose the same kind of classroom structure in the online environment. So, and then it would include grouping students particular ways, since everybody has to be in some kind of group in order to manage a classroom. Whether the way we create assignments, the way we structure the student-teacher interaction. Way back in the early 90s, Tyack and Tobin came up with the notion of the grammar of schooling. And this is what they say about the grammar of schooling, because I think it's a good way to capture all the basic elements that we think go with a school. They said neither the grammar of schooling nor the grammar of speech needs to be consciously understood to operate smoothly. Indeed, much of the grammar of schooling, the basic construction of schooling, has become so well established that it's taken for granted as just the way schools are. It is the departure from customary practice in schooling or speaking that attracts attention. So what are the elements of this grammar of schooling, this basic structure, which we assume is what schools have to be? It includes, for example, in elementary schools, having one teacher for one classroom, or maybe a slight variation of that. In secondary schools, having departmentalized program with subject specialists and students taking each individual subject. In the United States and maybe around the world, we use something called the Carnegie unit to measure completion, progress towards completion. Every time you complete a certain amount of seat time, a certain amount of attendance, you get credit for that. And as these pile up, you qualify for graduation. We think of instruction in subject areas, instruction in biology, instruction in algebra, instruction in history, classroom organization and management. We have that teacher standing in front of the classroom, teacher directing things, teacher as the power in the classroom. We think of a school year, that there's a certain time to be in school, a certain time not to be in school. And to a great extent, we rely on standardized testing to tell us who's making progress and who isn't. So when I looked to begin this, thinking about this presentation, I thought, of course, I'll look at the research. And I recognize that a ton has been written about why things change or don't change in education. For example, look at the results I received when I asked Google Scholar just about the question of educational change. I got over 4 million results, a little bit too much. So I tried to narrow it down, and I put in educational change theory, general principles that could help us explain the change process in schools. And this is what I got. I got 3,450,000 results. Obviously, today I can't cover that kind of field, let alone in a day or even in certainly 90 minutes. So instead, what we'll do, I hope, is to, based on my experiences as an educator, particularly as a school leader, and informed by research, I'm going to try to present some of the things that I believe are the most important to consider when thinking about change, when planning change, when implementing change, when analyzing change, or even assessing change. And I'm going to start actually by not speaking and instead asking you for something to consider. So take a look at this. Let me set the stage for you and ask you to think to yourself for a moment about the problem it represents. Let's say you are in a leadership position in a school, and at various times during the day, you're on the staircases. You go from one floor to another. You notice that in this particular stairway, where you're standing at the intermediate landing, the light is out. Now the light is out. Light is fine at the top of the stairway, at the exit, but it's dark down here. And over the next couple of days, as you move about the school, you recognize that sometimes at the landing, sometimes at the exit, sometimes in the intermediate area down here in the stairwell, that a number of lights are out all through the building. It's not just one light, it's several lights, and it gets pretty dark down here, so that could be dangerous. So what I'd like you to do is to take a moment and think about the situation and try to think about what the problem is and what the solution should be. And I mean, go beyond just thinking about, well, I have to replace the bulbs. How would you address this as a recurring issue, as a problem that keeps happening? So I just want you to hold on to your thinking. I'll give you a minute or so to think about it, and then we'll resume. Also give you a chance to take a break and stop listening to me for a minute so I don't drone on and on. But think about what the problem is, why it's recurring, and what the solution would be. Remember, this is not just one stairway. This is several spots throughout the school. Bulbs are out. What's the problem? Why is it occurring? And how can you fix it? Okay, thank you for that. Hold on to those thoughts. So let's start thinking about how to understand and maybe even guide change and guide the change process from 30,000 feet, as we'd say in the USA, or about 9,100 meters. Looking down now, we can see that schools are a type of organization. Specifically, they're complex adaptive organizations. So what does that mean? Well, let's look. They can't be understood just by looking at the arrangement of their parts or the sequencing of their parts. They're systems. They have many components: students, teachers, materials, facilities, social groups, occupational groups, teachers of one kind or another, school leaders of one kind or another, as well as products. They make things, they make learning, and ultimately, they make graduates. And these components engage with each other in different ways. And the way that they engage with each other influences what happens next. So all these factors, students, teachers, school leaders, materials, supplies, curriculum, parents, they all get involved with each other, and that interaction produces different results. They have internal and external environments. So things happen within the school, things happen outside the school, and there are factors that go back and forth. There are forces that go back and forth. There are communications that go back and forth. There are interactions that go back and forth all the time, all the time. The school, even though once the school day begins, it's never separate from the bigger environment in which it operates. The internal stuff that goes on in the school influences what happens outside the school, and certainly what happens outside the school influences what goes on inside the school. Ultimately, the school influences the environment by the graduates it sends out into the world. The other thing to keep in mind is that there are people involved in this. These are actors. They are agents. They interact with each other. They have agency. They have the ability to impact other things. They have the ability to influence other things. They act upon themselves and they act upon others, and they make decisions. think about how many decisions teachers, school leaders make every day, every minute, deciding what to do and how to do it, when to look up, when to listen to somebody, when to speak, when to talk to a student, when not to talk to a student, when to write something, when to emphasize something. Thousands of decisions during the course of a day. So these decisions, the influences that people have on each other, and the products that they create, whether they're work products or whether they're curriculum products or whether they're learning products or whether they're ultimately the graduates that a school district or a school system finishes, these are connected. They're all connected in events. They all come together. They all influence each other in a constant meshing of things over and over again. And a lot of this takes place on an almost minute by minute perspective. There's always something that needs to be addressed. You know, how many days do you have where everything goes exactly as planned? How many days does any educator have that goes exactly as planned? So let's think about that, not just as a series of events, but as kind of small changes. But I won't use the word change at the moment. I'll use small adaptations. One thing was planned, didn't happen, there's an adaptation, you move on and go with it. So all this activity creates these adaptations or some kind of adjustment in order just to continue functioning. It might be a big thing, this adaptation, like a curriculum change, or something less extensive, like ordering new tables for the cafeteria. And we can't forget that once an adaptation is made, once these little changes, these little modifications are made, it changes what previously existed. You know, attorneys always say, lawyers always say, you can't unring a bell. Once it happens, it happens. So over time, the accumulation of these adaptations itself becomes an influence on what happens next and the way things are done and what will be done in the future. So these little tiny things over time, they have influence as a total, as an aggregate. So again, I'd like you to think for a moment. I'll give you this situation. It's a change. We may not think of it in the kind of way we think about changes, about curriculum changes or instructional changes or assessment changes, but it's a change. And I want to keep this as we can focused on the ground level. So let's say here's the situation. Let's take some good news and see how all these things are connected. We talked in the previous slide about how schools are these ongoing connections of things and they influence each other constantly. It's a big system where one part engages with another and then another part engages with another and they all work together. So let's take some good news and see how things are connected. Let's say it's approaching the beginning of a new school year. And as a school leader, you find out that school enrollment has increased. Maybe a lot of kids are coming back to school after the pandemic and it wasn't anticipated. It's gone up so much, in fact, that you have to add another class, a full other class, and staff it with another teacher or another series of teachers. You know, schools would generally rather gain students than lose them. So this is not a bad development. This is okay. So I'd like you to think about in terms of this chart on the screen and answer the questions as much as you can in the next 3 minutes. So I want you to think about, okay, I have to open a new classroom and the kids are coming. What actions need to be taken? Who else besides you as the decision maker will be involved and why you need them to be involved? And I want you to think about this from the whole picture. You're walking into just an empty room and think about the process that would have to take place to get that class ready for the students who are coming within the next several days. All right, I'll give you, 2 or 3 minutes. And if you can hold your thoughts and then don't do anything, and then I'll ask you for some responses. All right, thanks. Any questions about that? All right, thank you. We'll take another 30 seconds or so. I hope you can see there are two questions that were raised. And I think we will address these at least in part as we go through the presentation. So if you can just be patient for a couple of minutes, and we'll see if we can get to that. Okay. So in the chat, if you don't mind, or if someone can, it's going to be hard for me to recognize anybody if you see who's raising a hand, but if our friends can help us.
Yeah, I'll help you, Dr. Robert. If anyone
Thank you.
raises his hand, I will.
Yeah. So I'd like to look at the first column. So let's just take a minute. So specifically, what action needs to be taken? What's one thing you would definitely have to do in order to get to school, in order to get this class ready? Yes, think about the order supplies, chairs, desks, equipment. Terrific. Change finance. Terrific. Have a teacher appointed. Outstanding.
There is Benny Clones is raising her or his hand.
Yes. Please go ahead.
So, Mr. Omar, can you just allow them to speak?
We're getting a lot of great answers in the chat. I'm sorry if we can't hear the person the question. A whiteboard and projector, safety and rule. Terrific.
Benny, just you need to unmute yourself and speak.
Technology, schedules, transportation. Great, terrific. Okay, let's look at, thank you for the comments there. What about who else will need to be involved? So you've got this decision, you've got this issue. Now, who else needs to be involved? So if you could take a moment and put in the chat or raise your hand if you want to contribute.
We have Ms. Mino also. Mino is raising his hand, or
we have a lot of great answers. Parents, student, management, teachers, principal, vice principal, support staff, HR, outstanding, IT, somebody with a budget director, head of schools. Terrific. And basically, the same answer is going to go for counselors. Terrific. Great answers. So the question is, why do they need to be involved? Why do they need to be involved?
Ms. Monia is raising her hand. Ms. Monia? You need to unmute yourself and start talking, Ms. Monia.
As about the previous part of the question, who
Yes.
to be involved, and I was going to suggest that we might get the community involved in terms of those who want to donate and contribute.
Excellent idea.
Thank you.
Okay.
And we're getting a lot of responses in the chat for the third question, and yes, somebody just said it's inclusive to make everyone aware and be involved to be successful, and because it's a decision that affects the entire school. Yeah, so we see And these are great answers: to support each other, teamwork, right? We all understand that these things work best, that one person, a school leader, or even a team of school leaders cannot really have an effective impact by themselves. No matter what we do in school leadership positions, we work with others, through others, involve others, distributed leadership. Yes, it's all important. We can't do it on ourselves. We can't do it physically on ourselves. We certainly can't do it emotionally by ourselves. But in terms of just organizational management, it's impossible to get this done, to get anything done, even just opening a classroom, even just buying the furniture and putting the furniture in the room. It's impossible without getting a lot of other folks involved and meaningfully involved in order to make it work. Thank you for that exercise. I appreciate it. And I appreciate all the responses. There are going to be other opportunities to engage in responses as well. And now that we see that the microphones, the audio can work, please, if you have something you'd like to talk about, let's talk about it as well.
And there is Mr. Tariq, Dr. Robert. He raised his hand.
Yes, go ahead.
I allowed Mr. Tariq to.
Yes, Mr. Tariq, unmute yourself and speak, please.
Okay, Ms. Rosina, you can talk also.
All right, we're going to move on if that's okay. Well, thank you for your participation in that exercise. So going back to this notion, we see that schools have a lot of folks involved, schools have a lot of folks involved in just about everything. Every decision, every change, every modification is going to involve lots of folks. And I'm just trying to get the chat back on, not successfully. And we said schools were complex adaptive organizations. So this adaptability, this ability to change like a little bit at a time, to make these minor modifications and yet still hold together as an organization without changing dramatically all the time. This adaptability is useful because there's so many forces, and we just saw an example of that, so many things that have to be done that operate in the internal and external environments in schools, that it's good that they're kind of stable, that they kind of resist, you know, making dramatic changes all the time. Sorry, my screen just fell down. They resist that notion of having the world stop because something has to change. They kind of go with the flow a lot. And that's good because there's short-term benefit, because there's so much happening in a given day that you need some consistency, you need some stability. But it also creates problems with coherence. And coherence is a notion that Fullen and Quinn developed, and it's a problem of it's blending everything together. It's having everything work towards the same goals. So when you have schools that are kind of these little pockets of things all the time, we're going to talk about this more, that they kind of resist big changes because they need stability. It creates a problem with any change in creating coherence, because this changes a little, that changes a little, and maybe over time they get out of line with each other. They don't really follow each other anymore. They don't really mesh with each other anymore. So this notion of coherence goes beyond just alignment like that. It's a real understanding about a shared purpose, a shared nature of our work together. And what happens in schools over time is that gets a little cloudy. People kind of go in their own directions and it becomes a little fuzzy, and this coherence breaks down. And there's so much going on in a school on any given day that you can often say they operate on the edge of chaos. There's so much happening. It's hard to control it all. And it's a border between control and instability. So I'll give you an illustration of that. My cousin just told me this story. She worked as a school aide, as a teacher assistant in a first grade classroom. And she has no real teaching experience, but she's had this job for I think about 8 months, 7 months, 8 months. And the teacher became ill. I don't know whether it was COVID or not, but the teacher became ill and was out for a couple of weeks. And without the teacher, she told me the class descended into chaos. Not that there wasn't a substitute, but the class quickly dissolved into chaos with first graders, 6-year-old students. It broke down. And that's why I thought that that notion that schools operating on the edge of chaos is important, because if they don't have this framework of stability, if they don't have this resistance to moving and changing direction all the time, they probably would be in chaos. But as we see, it's a double-edged sword, because at the one hand, it promotes stability, and on the other hand, it generates a resistance to change and mitigates against coherence. And this is another concept that I think is relevant here. So when we talk about the way schools are organized, Carl Weick back in the 1970s came up with this notion called loose coupling. And I think it's very useful because I think it does describe, at least schools that I've been associated with, it describes schools very well. Loose coupling is a metaphor, and I'm going to show you a graphic in a moment, but what it means is that there are, and you may have heard of this, there are several ways to produce acceptable results. There's no one way that anybody thinks of that produces results. There are many ways and different ways that this can get done. For example, there's a lack of coordination among the components. There's a certain messiness to schools all the time. The rules and regulations are missing or loosely enforced. Not that they don't exist. People know what the rules are. People know what the regulations are. But, you know, teachers have often told me, and maybe this happened to you too, they've said something like this: once I close the classroom door, the classroom is mine. And I don't really care what the principal or the head of school says. I do things my way. They also, in loosely coupled schools, they have slow responsiveness to directives and slow feedback processes. So yeah, I can ask you to do something or direct something, but it might happen right away. It might happen later. And there's slow feedback. You don't often know exactly what's going on and how well your directives or the rules or the expectations have been implemented. And managerial prerogatives, your ability to do things is limited. I worked with a Board of Education president who said to me that leaders in schools, as opposed to leaders in industry where he worked, have very few carrots which to entice people to do something, and even fewer sticks with which to make them do something. So this loose coupling metaphor is that schools can't be simply understood by looking at their formal structures. And schools survive this loose coupling notion, again, like the complex adaptive systems, helps schools survive by helping them avoid rapid and unnecessary changes. Maybe the school leader wants to do something, or somebody from the outside wants to do something, a parent group or a government group, but schools don't change that quickly. So it helps them avoid rapid and sometimes unnecessary changes, because we've all experienced the fact that a lot of people have ideas about what schools should do, and they're not always great ideas, and yet they want to impose them on schools. In schools, some parts may be more tightly coupled or loosely coupled than others. So yeah, perhaps the cafeteria is a smoothly running operation where you feed kids very efficiently. That's tightly coupled. But classrooms, maybe not so much. So the advantage of loose coupling, and we've said this a couple of ways, it promotes creativity because I'm not telling you exactly what you have to do every moment. Flexibility and hyper-local adaptation. Everybody says, yeah, schools are generally the same, but each school is different. And each school has a different group of students. Teachers will always tell you, oh, my students every year are different, and I treat every student differently, and no two students are the same, and no two classes are the same. And so loose coupling acknowledges that. It allows for less direct coordination, but increases the challenge of change. This is a diagram, a graphic that would represent tightly coupled schools. You see all the areas of overlap. There's a lot of consistency here. There's a lot of places where people interact with each other in a very organized way. In fact, it looks a lot like the typical organizational chart, where the manager is at the top and then tells a subordinate what to do, and that subordinate tells somebody else, and it all works in a very kind of linear, straightforward fashion. As opposed to a loosely coupled system, where those connections are, you know, they're not straight, they're kind of wavy, they're kind of loose, they're kind of fragile. And I thank Dr. Martin Borlowski of University of Ottawa for this. You can see the connections are not as strong. They could possibly shake loose at some point. So let me put this in context for you. If the core purpose of schooling is to produce learning for students, and the center of this activity is the classroom, and in that center of activity is the teacher-student relationship, because that's the primary way things are going to get done. And what happens in the context of schools? Well, if there's loose coupling, there's not a lot of agreement about the technical core of schools, the practices relating to instruction and learning. Earlier in this presentation, we talked about the debates in the United States about how to teach math. And you could extend that debate to almost every subject. And then you could extend it to how to teach in general. No one says they have the perfect way of teaching, and everybody has their opinion about how teaching should go. And sometimes they overlap, but a lot of times they're different. And we've seen that there are a lot of advances in our understanding of cognition, how people think, and brain functioning, but we haven't really been able to directly connect that to classroom practice yet. So classroom practice operates on a lot of experience and a lot of intuition and a lot of gut feeling. And because schools are loosely coupled, where what the director says isn't automatically implemented exactly the way he or she wanted it, there are limited ways to ensure implementation of curriculum and instructional practices with fidelity, the way they're intended, and sustainability. And yet, at the same time, you have all these things that mitigate, that argue against having things happen exactly the way they should be desired to happen. In that context, even though that's the way schools operate with this loose coupling, there's tremendous pressure on schools to produce results that are acceptable in the broader environment, in the world outside, right? So we have this kind of loose arrangement inside, but outside the world wants us to act in a particular way, which often changes from moment to moment or day to day or month to month or year to year. And they want us to look and act in a particular way, not just produce certain results, but to look a certain way, to use certain practices, to use certain things in teaching and learning. So as a result, there's no consensus about how to produce acceptable results. There's no universal agreement about what good teaching practice is and what good results constitute. Maybe it's standardized test results. A lot of people say it isn't. And educators themselves are buffeted by these many influences that provide recommendations about how to teach, how to assess learning, how to engage with the school community, and even how to lead. You look in the literature, should we be a transformational leader? Should we be a transformative, transactional leader? Should we be an instructional leader? What should we be? And even if a consensus about leadership existed, there are limited ways to generate broad levels of acceptance about that. So there's limited ways for us to even create that model and have that model exist in many schools throughout the country, throughout the world. And in that vacuum, in that lack of knowing exactly what produces what, when that's a vacuum of thinking, what fills the void, what fills the emptiness? Values and beliefs about schooling, values and beliefs. And yet schools are expected to look a certain way and to conform to society's expectations. So what happens is that whatever the current strategy is out there in the public that's being debated, in the United States, for example, it's the use of technology, problem-based learning, project-based learning, a differentiated instruction. Schools give superficial recognition to that in order to look right for the community. They don't really change that much in practice, when you dig deep down and look to see what's going on in classrooms, there hasn't been that much change, but they kind of look different and they start to sound a little different, so that they can appear to maintain legitimacy in the eyes of the community, and they seem to be functioning well, but change is slow and often resisted. And then we add to this the fact that schools are organizations, and all organizations have cultures. Culture is defined as the way we do things around here. I think that's the best definition. It's those deeply held and shared beliefs and values and symbolic meanings that we all have internalized in the groups that we're in. And cultures can be good and bad. They can be positive or toxic. They create a framework for understanding a school's history and its relationship with the community and the environment and the value of any change. Culture tells you, your organizational culture tells you if something is valuable for change or not. It tells you how to form and maintain relationships. What are the protocols for interacting with each other in the school? Usually there may be a written list, but usually there's a whole bunch of variables as well, informal ones about how we relate to each other. That's part of the culture. And it guides sense making, how the members of the school define the situations they encounter and the information that they encounter. And culture defines what's acceptable and what isn't. And because it's so deeply held, it operates out of the awareness. You don't even think about it most of the time. You don't think about what the school culture rules are. In school cultures, the grammar of schooling is an element in many cultures. The things we talked about a half hour before, grade levels, subject areas, the teacher-student relationship, grading, all those things are part of school culture. Also, in the United States, at least, presentism is a big part of school culture. It focuses on short-term results. I'm looking to get through the day or the week rather than look ahead. Academic freedom and the sanctity of individual classrooms. My classroom is my classroom, and you can't tell me what to do because I am the leader in my classroom. There's a tremendous emphasis now on safety and security and orderliness. We want the classrooms to be orderly in some way. Citizenship would define not just as the understanding governance, but understanding what the role of a citizen is, you know, how you behave in society. Grading, the fixed or growth mindset is, do you believe that everybody just comes and they have, when they're born, they have particular aptitudes and don't have some other aptitudes? Or do you think these can be taught and learned? There are subcultures within schools. Different grade levels may have a different culture. For example, in schools that I've been associated with in high school, the science department itself has been divided into several different groups. There's the chemistry teachers, there's the biology teachers, there's the physics teachers, and they all look at things a little differently. Cultures can be moving or stuck. Moving cultures are the ones that accept the need to keep changing, to keep looking for new things. Stuck cultures say, you know, things are good as they are. If it's not broke, don't fix it. And generally, school culture upholds the notion that our school and my classroom or my school is unique. Every year it's different, but every year that's a unique set of circumstances. And you may say what works for you in some other place, but I know what works for me. And the last thing I'll talk about here is sense making. And these are the logics that people apply to make meaning of their collective, of their experience. It's the way, because so much is coming to us all the time. There's so much information being given to us, so much stimulation, so much activity in a school. Sense making are the rules that we apply to make sense of things. It's socially constructed. So I belong to many groups. I belong to my school group, my grade level, my subject area, but I also belong maybe to a professional organization. I belong to a family. And each of those gives me assumptions and understandings that help me structure what's important and what's not important. And I look for patterns. Sense making is a pattern making process where people look for patterns and look to identify what's important, because so much information is presented, even as we're speaking now, so much information is presented. We look for those kernels that tell us what's important. And what happens with sense making is that an intended change may be implemented, but educators the way it makes sense to them may not match. So, for example, we've learned through research that teachers and school leaders are more likely to accept or accommodate a change when it aligns, at least in some way, to their existing beliefs and their school culture. So if you tell me something to change and it's already kind of aligned, it complements what we're already doing, I might make sense of that. And they also identify as important only of those aspects of a proposed change that aligns with their beliefs and their values that they already have. So I'm going to tease out what I think is most important based on my values and beliefs. And then they'll selectively adopt or support aspects of the change that fit that view of the way we do things around here. So what happens is that changes get proposed and tried to implement it. And a lot of times teachers will pick, and school leaders will pick apart the things they want to implement part of that change. And they'll take part of this and part of that, part of this, part of that. Not the whole thing, but the pieces that appeal to them most. And you get a lot of people saying, oh yeah, we're already doing that. We're already doing that. It's a question of these forces of fact intersecting with belief and producing something that's kind of a blend of the two. Okay, a minute or two for us to pause and reflect. Something maybe you found interesting or important, a question you have about what's been presented, or something you'd like to learn more about. Please, in the chat or speak up.
Good day for you, Dr. Robertson.
Yes, yes.
I would like to thank you so much. It has been informative, and I'm one of the middle leadership in my school. I would like to emphasize that there's a lot of difference, and what we are facing is the idea of management versus the idea of leadership. What we see around us is more of a managerial task done, not the leadership going on. And this is the difference between success and failure in many schools. We're still going in circles. This is happening because there's a confusion, even at leadership level, between the leadership and the management.
Yes.
Micromanagement is a toxic process. It's not letting anyone grow in many schools. So I'd like to thank you for the info about leadership and difference between leadership and management.
Oh, you're very welcome. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
We have some questions. Isn't the loosely coupled system or a barrier for implementing new reforms? Yes, it can be, because the difficulty is that these are not tightly connected. And it is, in fact, one of the barriers that we have to overcome. And this is where we get into the artistry of leadership, not just the science of leadership. And I'm going to talk about in a couple of minutes a strategy that can perhaps help us understand which of those connections to emphasize most strongly in a given situation. If you just hang on a second, I hope we'll address that. A mention of Sengi, yes, a lot of this comes definitely related to Sengi's work on systems. The hidden curriculum being the most important factor contributing to culture. Yes, because culture operates so much out of awareness. We don't teach the organizational culture, but people get the message, and we'll talk about that in a moment through various mechanisms. You repeated the phrase, a lot of information, skills and attitudes. Absolutely. It's all part of that mix. What I'm trying to create is that there is tremendous amount of stimulation in a school. There's so many things going on at once that they need to be selective just to survive. And that selectivity influences the way schools stay the same or they change, either through sense making or through the organizational culture. They tell us what to attend to and what to and what to follow most closely. And so therefore, they're very influential in determining what comes next. So if you want to help determine what comes next, you have to influence those attributes. You have to influence the culture, you have to influence sense making, etc. Sometimes what hinders positive constant change is frequent governing changes imposed by national institutions. Absolutely. And to some extent, loose coupling insulates us from that. But the big, I think the big trend in the past 20 years or so has been, at least the United States, and I think a good number of other countries, has been for more tightly, efforts to more tightly couple the system by insisting on certain outputs like standardized test scores and progress markers, progress benchmarks. That's an attempt to tightly couple the system to make it work. The question is whether that kind of force imposed from the outside can actually work. And I think what I've said up to this point shows that there are a lot of places where that can't work because the forces inside and the logic of education is too strong against it. So it resists that and will adopt only selectively the aspects of the change that make most sense given the current environment. I hope that makes sense. In other words, we pick and choose the things that people are trying to impose upon us to make it look like we're conforming, but a lot of things kind of stay the same underneath it. How do we create a positive school culture? Not as easy. Culture is very slow to change. We're going to talk about that in 1 minute. Oh, sorry. How to measure and highlight the impact of small adaptations. That's a job of leadership, I think, that school leaders have to be out in front of those things. I think, and you'll see as we talk about the framework for change, that selectively attending to the things you want to promote can have a great deal of impact on the overall direction of change. Let's move on. I know we're running out of time here. Here's a summary slide. We talked about schools are being complex adaptive organizations, that the fact that it's hard to make things change through loose coupling is pretty good sometimes because it insulates you against all these forces that are trying to make you change in 1,000 different directions at once, but it also makes coherence difficult. And we talked about sense making in this regard too. As well. Just another thought here at the bottom. This is new information. Sorry. Competing commitments. People often, this is not working. People sometimes feel pulled in different directions. They want to conform to the change. They want to implement the change. They want to make it happen, but they feel a competing commitment. You see this very often in classroom management, where someone will suggest a different style of working with students and they feel, yes, that's a great idea, I want to do it, but my sense that schools have to be orderly, that there has to be a firm direction provided by the teacher, that makes it very difficult for me to change. So it's not that I don't want to change, it's just that I feel pulled in two directions at the same time. We're going to skip this because it's going to take too long, but I'm going to summarize a way to look at change. So Bowman and Deal back in, I think, the 1980s proposed this, and I think it's a very helpful way to look at change, and it helps us direct our attention to the areas that need the most attention. So they proposed 4 frameworks, and again, I might be talking about something you already know, 4 frameworks that can help us kind of organize the way schools operate, that can help us address this complexity and the ambiguity of the way schools. There's a structural frame. So structure is involved with all the systems, the formal systems of the school, its structures, its processes, its rules and regulations, the metrics that it uses to measure things. It's a rational approach to schools. It has goals. Goals and objectives are part of the structural frame. If I want to change something, I create a goal for it and some objectives to go with it, and then we plan out how to do it. Then there's a human resources frame. So human resources says, yeah, structure, you can't exist without a structure, but schools are really composed of people. And therefore, you have to focus on relationships and their meaningful engagement. When people feel valued and connected, the organization grows, it prospers. People want to be part of it. They feel engaged, they feel empowered. Teacher leadership is part of this, engaging them. Then there's a political frame. And as much as we may say, schools are schools, they're not political organizations, every organization has politics because there's always power arrangements in organizations. There are always questions of allocations of resources. There are always temporary coalitions that develop. There are negotiations that happen about what to do next. And the political frame says conflict is inevitable. And I'm going to return to conflict in a couple of minutes. And you have to deal with that conflict productively in order to get something done. And finally, there's a symbolic frame, which focuses on the meaning of events, which different people may interpret differently. And it says organizational behavior can't be explained just by rational analysis. The structural frame and all that stuff that goes with it, it only goes so far. Really, it's the meaning people get from different things that helps them make sense of their world and empowers them to different activities. And in this symbolic frame, rituals and ceremonies and heroes and villains. Every school has heroes and villains. I don't mean in the criminal sense. I mean the sense of people that are looked up to. There's always legends about great teachers and great administrators and great everythings. And then there are the not so great ones that people talk about. Oh, this reminds me of so-and-so. And storytelling has a tremendous amount of value in this. People pass on information about the culture through storytelling, and it helps people find meaning and purpose. Too often, people inside, but mostly outside schools, think that the structural model is what makes things change happen. And so they give us rules and regulations and laws, and they tell us we have to do this, that, and the other thing. And they think that's what's going to make things happen, but they ignore these other frames as a result. So the artistry of leadership is really to pick the frame that matches the situation that you have. Pick the frame or frames, because it's probably more than one, and then target your interventions as a result. So we come back to this. Now, remember, there are lights out, a lot of places around the school. Is this a structural problem? Let me go back. Is this a system problem? Is it a goal and objective problem? Is it a human resources problem? Is it a political problem? Is it a symbolic problem? Is there something cultural about this? I'd like you to take a minute because we don't have much time, and I want to make sure that we cover all the points. But I want you to take a minute, and if you could use the chat and or raise your hand and say, now that you thought about it this way, tell us why it would be one type of problem or another. Is it structural? Is it human resources? Is it political? Is it symbolic? And it could be all the above, but we'd like to see how you look at it. Because I think the point here is to open your eyes and open our collective eyes into seeing problems from many dimensions and then picking the ones that make the most sense at the moment. Okay, take 1 minute. We'll look forward to your responses in the chat. Some good responses so far. Please, some more. Some good responses so far. Please, some more. Okay, another 15 seconds or so. Please, some more responses. Terrific. Terrific. So, and you can keep responding. And I really do appreciate the thoughts. So we see there are many ways to look at this. So yeah, maybe it's a problem. And again, we don't know the situation here. I've given you just a case, the outline of a case. So it really, in order to follow up, you would have to do some more investigation. But here are the ways to look at this. Is this a structural problem? Is this something where the assignment of goods, the assignment of the responsibility wasn't fulfilled? Somebody's fallen down on a job. They're not doing their job. Do they need better goals? I want 100% of the bulbs to be on 100% of the time. Is it a human resources issue? Yeah, maybe the person needs training. Maybe they're motivated. Maybe they haven't been given the tools and the kind of operational thought about, you take care of this building. This is your responsibility. How can I help you do your job better in maintaining the building? Is it political? Right? Maybe there's a question of whose job it is. Is it maintenance? Is it the custodian? Is it some outside contractor? Is it nobody? Is it a volunteer? Maybe it's a question of no resources have been provided for this. And then is it symbolic? Is it a fact, for example, that no one has made this important? That the way the school looks is not important in the school culture, that safety and security like that is not really thought of as a primary priority. So yeah, it's more likely there are combinations of these things that operate all at once, but it helps you kind of analyze the situation from different perspectives. And then knowing what you know, because you know your school's best, then you can take the actions that make the most sense. So thank you. And this was just a guide to help us structure our thoughts. So if it's structural, then we should do this. If it's human resources, then we should do this. Political, do this. Symbolic, do that. I want to talk about resistance to change for a couple of minutes, and hopefully we'll get out to conflict. So if you remember where we started, point that we said schools are these kinds of multiple stimuli places where lots happening all the time. And that they can operate if the structures were taken away, if things change too rapidly, they can operate on the edge of chaos, and there's loose coupling, and that they also have to maintain stability and legitimacy in the eyes of their communities, and that organizational culture is hard to change. Schools also have a history of initiative overload, too much being asked to them at one time. This mandate, that mandate, this law, this regulation, this directive, it's all a mishmash, and they never get a chance to finish anything because one thing starts before another thing is finished. There's also a disconnect between educational research and school life. And I've seen that firsthand in the university. And then there's also teacher turnover and leadership turnover, which creates a lot of churn, and it's hard to maintain continuity. So resistance to change in that kind of context is reasonable. If so much is in flux all the time, it's reasonable to think that I'm going to be resistant about any particular change. I'm going to hold on to what I have. So some thoughts and some questions just to think about as you are planning a change. What's the real goal? And what does the goal look like when it's achieved? Because if that's, when you think that through, then maybe you can tolerate a lot more flexibility in your thought. If the real goal, for example, is to produce better, let me put it this way. If the real goal is to produce problem-solving capabilities among students, maybe there are a number of ways of getting to that rather than just one way. And what does problem-solving look like? Maybe I think I know what problem-solving looks like, but when I talk to the staff or the community, they have another idea. So we have to make sure the definition is the same. Are you personally prepared for the ups and downs? Change is difficult. And you have to be kind of, as a school leader, you have to be kind of ready to take those ups and downs and be able to handle it. Will the change have meaningful impact? The number one question to answer for all your stakeholders is, how will this make things better? That's what they want to know. For me, for my students, for this school, how will they make things better? Are there multiple sources of evidence? Because people want evidence. They want sureness before they move on. How easy to change to implement? How much energy does it require? Teaching and learning teaching is a very demanding profession. Before teachers change, it's going to require a lot of energy. So how much energy does it require? Will they have the energy to do it? How much time will be required? What barriers need to be removed? Can you show me that it works? Yes, professional learning is important, but practice changes beliefs. We know this from research and practice. Actually doing something, change your beliefs, and once you change your beliefs, you embrace the new practice. What's the cost of inaction versus inaction? In other words, if you can show somebody that the cost of inaction is more than the cost of action, it helps to convince them. And what's the low-hanging fruit? What can I easily do? I read something somewhere, and I don't remember the exact source, called the 15% solution. So rather than try the whole change at once, if you can get 15% of it done, that creates a lot in your regard. It creates some practice that people can believe in. It creates some evidence. It creates some symbolic victory. People like to be involved in something that's producing results. It gives you a sense of momentum. So that's all good. We also have to remember our school's history, because history weighs upon us. I was trained as an historian, and the past weighs upon the present. I want to talk about buy-in or ownership. Buy-in, we often talk about people buying into something. Buy-in implies that I'm selling you something. I don't want to be selling something. I want you to own it. I want you to feel part of it. Ownership is driven in his research on psychological ownership, which comes from business and marketing and social psychology. There are three things involved in having ownership of something. One is having some control of it. So you have to empower your staff and everybody involved in the change. Another one is identity, to have respect and have a sense of I'm involved in this and my involvement is productive, it's meaningful. And the last one is a sense of home, that this is a part of me. It's an organizational kind of culture thing where I'm part of this big entity and it's important. And then we talk about the cultural elements. Will it improve relationships? Michael Fullan says, all change ultimately relies on relationships. And if relationships don't improve at the end of a change, the change will not stick. Does it promote collaboration and inquiry? Can we use cultural levers like symbolism and ceremonies and celebrations to generate momentum? Can we find a zone of acceptance? This is like the zone of proximal development in cognitive theory, where we create a change that's it requires people to stretch a little bit, but isn't so far beyond them that they can't do it. Does it address values or beliefs? Can we tolerate mistakes? How much flexibility are we willing to tolerate? And can create dissonance between what people think they act on, the theories that they act on, the values that they hold, and the actual things that they do. And last, how conflict can be addressed. So I want to just go on to conflict, then time for Q&A. Conflict in organizations is inevitable. Whenever change is proposed, even these modifications that we've made, we talked about them as minor changes, conflict is inevitable. And it's often considered an indicator of organizational ill health, dysfunction, but it's not. But because it's thought of as organizational dysfunction, sometimes leaders are prone to either avoid conflict. Hey, I don't want to deal with this. This is not good. Or attack it. So I'm the school leader. This is what has to be done. But if you don't address conflict, it erodes trust, which erodes the culture, which changes sense making, which creates even more loose coupling, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but properly handled, conflict can promote innovation, revitalization, growth, and bonding. And there are three types of conflict. Interpersonal. We know about interpersonal conflict for sure. Everybody knows about interpersonal conflict. But then there's task conflict. What are we being asked to do? Or is it process conflict? I agree with the task, but I don't like the process. So again, as a leader, you have to think about these things. We try to avoid the interpersonal conflicts because they get emotional. and instead turn it into a task conflict or a process conflict. See what parts of it can be aligned with the task or a process, which are much easier to deal with. And conflict has cognitive and affective dimensions. I understand the conflict, but I also feel it. These are 5 strategies to address conflict. I'll let you read them rather than talk through them. But regardless of which strategy works in these 5 strategies that were presented, conflict, you have to get to those points. So people say, okay, I want people to shift perspectives. That's how we'll solve this. But how do you get them to do that? So I want to just talk to you for 1 minute, if I can, have 1 minute more about design thinking, which I'm not going to talk about in depth. We have an article in Educational Leadership this month about it. But we believe it builds relationships by involving everybody in meaningful, constructive dialogue in a structured process to promote problem solving and conflict management. I talk about the elephant and the rider. The elephant is your emotions. The rider is your brain. This is from the Heath brothers. They use this great metaphor. Obviously, the elephant is much more powerful than the rider. So the rider has to be very strategic about how to deal with change, because you don't want to rouse the elephant and get it to behave erratically. So design thinking does that. And it's a 5-step process involving first empathizing, which means go out and find out what people are thinking and feeling about this. Really try to put yourself in their shoes. And once you've gathered that understanding, once you feel you understand where the conflicting sides think and feel about this, then you can better able to define the problem, which often is not the presenting problem. It's often something underneath it. And then you can think about it, and then you can identify many possible solutions to it, come up with a few good ideas in step 4, and try them out, see what people think about them, maybe pilot them, and then test them for real, and then go through the process. It's actually not a sequence. It's a kind of iterative process over and over again, where one step informs the other, but putting it this way enables you to see the whole thing. So in summary, there are 4 aspects to change to consider. One is your local setting. I really do believe we have to take into account everything that our schools, our particular schools, are about, because otherwise the change won't make sense. The second thing is the adoption of the change. The third thing, what you're proposing to adopt. The third thing is fidelity. How much flexibility is there in that? How much can we be creative? How much can we deviate from the model? And the last part is sustainability. How can I make this stick? And I hope that some of the things that we've talked about today have enabled you to think about making changes and also making change stick. So last slide, there are good reasons for schools to slow to change, but change is possible. Meaningful change is possible. Consider loose coupling, consider organizational culture, consider sense making. And when you've done that, take the 4 frames and try to apply them to the given situation, and consider what these issues are and what dimension they fall in. We've given some thoughts about addressing resistance to change, and ultimately, I hope using design thinking, and I could do a whole session on design thinking as a way to address conflict in a constructive way and move the school from one place to another with fidelity, or reasonable amount of fidelity, and with sustainability. Okay, I'm sorry I kind of ran over a few minutes. I'd be happy to entertain any questions if we have time for that, or comments.
I think there is one, Louina, she's raising her hand. So we will take the, if anyone want to ask a question or raise his hand, and then we'll go to the Q&A.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, Louina.
Yes, good evening, sir. Good evening.
Hi, how are you?
And Dr. Robert, that was a really very interesting session.
Thank you.
I'm not having a question. Rather, I would like to make 2 observations. When it comes to change, these are the two things I find. We have two complexes: a hero complex, and the other complex is what I do is right, and everybody should do what I do. Let me first explain the hero complex. That has something to do with what you were talking last. Everybody is waiting for a hero, in the sense, right? Yesterday's session, we spoke about leadership and how we should make all of our students leaders. Like every student should be a leader. When I put across this point to my family and friends, they were like, "Oh, so you mean to say that everybody has to be a leader? Nobody is going to be following? This is not going to work." This is what, this is the feedback I got. And actually there was a question in yesterday's session also commenting on that you mean to say that all the students are supposed to be leaders? The world has not yet wrapped their minds around this particular concept, that everybody should rise up to the occasion, instead of waiting for a hero. And unfortunately, our education system is also moving. We haven't, as of now, we haven't done anything to encourage this, this thought in our students to rise up to the occasion. You are a leader. Come up. You don't wait for a hero to come and save you. So this particular aspect of leadership, I don't know how we are going to be teaching our students, but unfortunately, this is what is happening. And the second one is very, very widespread across every place. The leaders or people in power, they are of the opinion that what they do is right, and there is no other right way of doing whatever it is that they are supposed to do. That is why I think they have a blockage when teachers, we say, my classroom, my rules, let me do what I have to do my way. So when a teacher says that, this is seen like a challenge to anybody who is higher up in that teacher. So basically we are clipping the independence of the teacher to do what he or she wants to do the way they want to do it, because we think that what we are telling is the right way and they have to do it this way. So these are the two observations I made with respect to leadership and changes. And I think these are blocking us from moving forward with our changes. These are resisting changes. This is my observation, sir.
Thank you. So, I think, I teach courses in leadership, and I think what I try to get across to my students is that I'm trying to give them a lot of knowledge. Obviously, I'm trying to share research and these frameworks for ways of looking at things and stuff like that. But there's a certain amount of balance in leadership between what you know and artistry. There is an artistry to leadership. It's knowing when to move ahead, when not to move ahead, when to push something, when not to push something, how much of a change is acceptable, how much is not acceptable. And all these are very delicate questions. We can provide the frameworks and we can provide some background knowledge for that, but ultimately it's up to the individual to make those decisions. And that requires as much foundational knowledge as you can have, plus a lot of observational skill. You've got to be able to look at the situation, respect all the parties involved, give an opportunity for everyone to be involved to the greatest extent possible. And ultimately, yes, people have to make decisions and they have to lead. They can't just be followers, but it has to be the most informed, most involved decision-making process as possible.
There is few questions in Q&A, Dr. Robert.
Yes.
So,
can you advise? You want me to do the Q&A?
You want me to go to? Yeah, please.
Okay. Can you advise on the best strategies for a principal to lead a change? Not really, because I think it's very situational. I think as I said, I think one has to be attuned to all the factors involved. And leadership is not easy. Leadership involves balancing a lot of considerations at one time. So I think the Bowman deal frameworks are a good place to start. I think if you can say in your mind, this is the big challenge. The challenge here is political, or the challenge here is structural, or the challenge is symbolic. It gives you a good place of where to start. As a general rule, I will tell you that I am very sympathetic and very aligned with the organizational culture view of this, because I think culture defines what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, and culture is very hard to change. So unless you work on the culture over time, it will defeat you. You have to understand the culture. You have to really immerse yourself in it. And one of the reasons I like design thinking as a kind of solution set is because it asks you first to empathize, to really understand what people are thinking and feeling, and then be able to make a move from there. So I would say those two things. Number one, the Bowman-Deere frameworks, which includes a kind of symbolic aspect, but also understanding the culture and really understanding what the bottom of the organization is, what the foundational elements of the school is, and then building on that. Is the 4 frames tool used to identify a problem, or is it used to solve a problem? And the answer is both. It's really designed as a leadership framework for you to kind of organize your thinking about a particular issue and your particular strategy. But it's also very useful in identifying what the problem is. So I would say use it for both. I have one question. Since we've been endlessly lecturing former educators ideological theories about how to lead forward to positive revolutionary change, why are we still in the phase of lecturing? And that's a really good question. And that's because if you're asking about this particular presentation, I think we're still learning how to use technology in a way that's more invitational and informal and less structured. And I don't think the technology is quite caught up with that yet. But in terms of classrooms, I think we're still in that teacher-led discussion mode, because we believe we're blinded to a certain extent by that grammar of schooling. We think this is the only way things could be. And because schools have been reluctant to change legitimately, because they've been reluctant to change and embrace things that haven't yet been proved. So we need a lot of pockets of innovation going on. And I think those pockets of innovation spread over time. I do believe that ultimately good ideas sell themselves. And I think eventually that model will change. Though I agree with the concepts you discussed with us, but where to demarcate the line, especially when we are pressurized externally. Yeah, it's a great point. We have a lot of pressures upon us. Typically what leaders do, I mean, if you take a step back, what leaders do to deal with that pressure is they take pieces of that pressure that they can live with, and they support those, and they tend to downplay the elements that they can't live with or the school culture can't live with. And of course, that mitigates against change, that makes change slow. But on the other hand, it makes you able to live your life, because otherwise the pressures for changing and changing quickly would be enormous. So you have to have a strong backbone, but also you have to be able to say, I can do this, but I won't do that. There's a common expression, you got to pick the hills you want to die on. And a colleague of mine, somebody I worked with, had put it even more dramatically. She would say, she'd look at her palm and she'd say, that's a scab I don't want to pick right now. So you figure out which hills you can really say, this is the most important thing, because it's important to the school culture, it's important to the organizational health, it's important to future change, and say, this is what I can do and this is what I can't do. And other times you simply have to accommodate. I'm a realist. There are times when people are going to force you to do things that you ordinarily would not want to do. But again, try to preserve that integrity, that whole, that piece that you think is most valuable, because ultimately that's what's going to help you steer a good path towards change. Did I miss anything? Should we consider bottom-up strategies such as PLCs? Yes, absolutely. PLCs, when you fit into that loose coupling design, PLCs do a number of things when they function well. They enable folks to have ownership, real ownership, and feel that they belong to this thing, and that they have direction and agency. It enables them to create some independence, but it also gives them a structure so that they're not wildly losing focus. They're focused very, very closely on student learning, and that's the thing they should be focused on. So they are a terrific mechanism when implemented well for creating productive change.
Dr. Robert, there is Ms. Monia. She raised her hand.
Yes, please.
Dr. Roberts and Dr. Muhammad, that was really informative and comprehensive. Thanks a lot. I just have 2 points that I wanted to see your views on. One that has to do with too much change, too quick, too speedy. Like when it comes, for example, to trying to adopt the most up-to-date changes in technology as they apply to education. They can be, it sometimes can be very stressful to the point that it is disruptive, not in the good way, not in the positive way, I mean, and because there would be some resistance. So here comes the word trendy, because sometimes people fall into the trap of trendiness. It's just sometimes people adopt some changes just for the look, for the facade. We're the best, we're adopting the most up-to-date technology and stuff like that. The second point has to do with the students' achievement and learning and success rates and results. I think with the application of certain strategies or devices of measurement like the KPI or success rates or percentages. And then when it comes to the low achievers, leaders or managers think that quick recipes like remedial work or can do everything, can be like a magic wand to solve all the problem. And if it doesn't, then probably the teachers are to blame. So this quick fix thing, especially when it comes to foreign language learning, because language is a process. You can't change someone level of language with a magic recipe, with a quick fix. Thank you so much.
No, thank you for those points. And I think the point you raised about technology is terrific. It illustrates exactly what I was, at least I hope I got some of the message across, that yes, there is this pressure to change all at once, and it can't happen like that. And so what happens is, we talked about sense making, is people adapt pieces that make it look like they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, people expect them to be doing, but it preserves the things that they're comfortable with because they know they can deliver that effectively. So it's, you know, this loose coupling, this sense making notions, they all insulate us a little bit from this desire for a quick fix. As I said, when you go back to those 4 frames, the way the world tends to look at schools is that they're structural organizations only. And if we change the goals and objectives, if we tell them what to do a little bit more clearly, they'll do it. But our experience is quite the contrary. First of all, kids aren't like that. They're not that adaptable, you know, and they can't be fixed all at once. So, or ever. So yes, this notion that we have to be sensible about how we approach change, and unfortunately, it falls on the shoulders of school leaders to kind of buffer their schools from this. They kind of have to take those directives on their backs and interpret them in a way that their schools can live with. So yeah, leadership is a tough thing, and the quick fix notion is something that the world at large believe schools can do, but they don't believe it in any other aspect of their life. So why would they believe it about schools? Change takes a while, and real change takes even longer. So I appreciate those comments.
Thank you, Ms.
Thank you
Monia.
so much, Doctor. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Amal?
Is there a question?
Yes, she raised her hand. Ms. Amal, you can unmute yourself and speak. She's having an issue with her.
In the meantime, I know there was a question. What do you think about schools that don't have any vision or planning for the future? A big mistake. First of all, if you don't plan for the future is going to happen anyway, and it will be imposed upon you. And the second thing is that the vision itself, I talked about the importance of organizational culture. Vision itself is a key element of organizational culture. If we create a system of beliefs that everybody holds on to and everybody grasps and says, this is the vision, this is what I want school to look like, and what I want our students to look like in the future, that becomes part of the way we do things around here. And it can really inspire people. The way to build that vision is obviously not by imposing it, by building it collectively. That's a kind of a process, but I think, yes, absolutely, vision is an essential part of that. In the Q&A, could you please share something transformed to a leader? Did it happen suddenly? What change you felt transformed from a teacher to a leader? What thinking a leader must have? I think I can only speak from personal experience. I think, look, when I was a teacher originally, I thought I was a pretty good teacher. And then when I became a school leader, I observed other teachers and I saw what good teaching really looks like. And I was not a good teacher. I think I was a pretty mediocre teacher. I've learned a lot about teaching since then, but I think I was pretty mediocre, even though I thought it was pretty good. And I think the same thing in leadership. I think reflection and professional learning are key parts of that. I think you have to be able to take a step back. Unfortunately, I've had some really good mentors and people I work with who've enabled me to do that. Plus, I think I have, I think being self-critical, not in the sense that you want to beat yourself up all the time, but I think being able to take some time at the end of a day or a week, more likely, because the end of the day never ends, but somewhere in that week to say what went well and what didn't go so well. We tend to focus on the things that don't go so well, but I wouldn't dwell on them. I mean, they're learning experiences, but I also think you have to focus a lot on what went well and try to tease out what are the elements that did that. For me, the Bowman deal frames, for example, were enormously helpful in, and believe it or not, this theoretical construct was enormously helpful in helping me understand the various aspects of what goes on as a leader. It helped me really kind of separate the important from the non-important. So I think that was very helpful too.
Thank you, Dr. Robert. Mr. Firas Al-Umari, he raised his hand twice, and if he wants just to ask any question, he's more than welcome. Mr. Firas? Maybe he's having an issue with his wife. Ms. Amal, still you have a question?
I see there's a question in the Q&A. How to convince people ready for a change? Most people don't like change. Yes, they're right. If you go back to this slide that I had on resistance, I don't know if I can get it up on the screen here. Hold on 1 second. So I'm just going to minimize this for a moment. Some things about, some things to consider here is the change going to promote improve relationships? That's really important. And find a zone of acceptance. Again, we go back to the zone of proximal development for kids. You can't put learning, a learning objective out there that's too far away from where they currently are. The same thing with change. You can't propose something or can't design something and then think it's going to be implemented. That's really beyond the grasp of the folks. They need work to get there. So I think that's important. And I think also is to answer this question. You have to answer this question. How will this make things better? That's what people want to know. If that becomes clear, a lot of the resistance falls away. The problem is that we often think that we've made it clear, but it's not. We think that by advocating something, it should be intuitively obvious, but it's not. It takes a lot of work and a lot of convincing for people to be able to embrace change. So that clearly is part of it as well. How much research is important for change? Yes, research is important. Particularly as a school leader, it's important to be able to provide examples of where it's worked. People like to see other schools where it's worked. I think that's very effective. So I always said that as a leader, I'm not always in the first wave of innovation. I don't really want to be out there if I'm leading a school. I want to be slow and steady wins the race, which is does not mean that I'm not in favor of change. In fact, change happens and did happen consistently. But what it means is I want to see how it works in practice, because the idea up here is not always translatable the way you imagined it into practice. So I want to see examples. And I think that's very convincing for people. If they can talk to others, if they can see that it works, if they can see data that shows that it works, but if they also can talk to people who have actually done it, I think that's very helpful. How do we make changes inside the classroom? Classroom, as we said, is pretty insulated. You know, that phrase, once I close the classroom door, I'm in charge. That's pretty important to recognize. So you have to get people to own the change. We talked about this as well. We talked about owning the change rather than buy-in. Buy-in is like, I'm giving you something, now you give me something in return. But ownership is a big part of that. It's cognitive and emotional. They have to feel that they own it, like it's part of them, and they also have to understand it. So the ways to do that are through giving them a lot of control, giving them a lot of information, helping them be part of that process, giving them respect for their professional ability and the status, and then giving them the sense that they own this, that it's something that not just that they know about, but it's something that they have, something that they understand so well that it becomes part of them. Again, that's a long process. So you look for incremental change along the way. You'll have some people who are always the big adopters, and they go right away and they're perfect with it. But most people are not like that. So we have to expect these kind of incremental change over the time. Okay.
I think this is the last question.
All right.
Yep. Ms. Munia, again, she raised her hand. Is it a question or a comment, Ms. Munia? I think she's just maybe by mistake. Okay, Dr. Robert, thanks a lot for the great and informative and interactive presentation. It's really a great pleasure to have you with us today, and I'm sure colleagues, all of them, benefit from the experience and will reflect in their leadership skills and in their educational institution that they are serving in. Thank you again, and
Thank
it's a
you.
pleasure to have you with us, and I'm sure we will be also having a collaboration in the coming BD certificates that we are having. Thank you, dear.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Good luck to everyone. Thank you so much for your attention, and I appreciate all the comments and the participation. So stay well, everyone.
Thank you, and have a great day ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you.